Welcome back to Relish the Journey. As always, I am your host, Miles Biggs, and I'm joined in this episode by Kathleen Majerski. Kathleen and I met through Strivent Coaching, some of the mastermind groups that I run and I'm a part of, and she's actually been helping me edit my book called Unseen Work. And in the process of going through the editing of the book and getting to know each other better, we just sort of realized, hey, Kathleen's got a bunch of unseen work too, and what led her to be an editor of books and a writer of her own pieces. So, Kathleen, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
So
excited to dive in.
Yeah, me too. And so I feel like I butchered that last name. I was asking you before we hit record how to pronounce it. It was Majerski, right?
Right.
But for those of you wondering how to spell that, it's literally Major Sky.
Yes.
So if that helps you with my pronunciation, it's Kathleen Major Sky. So tell us about how the sky is the limit, Kathleen, with your editing, all because of your previous life experiences. I'm not going to make you begin at the beginning, but where do you want to start to pick this apart to people who don't know your story yet?
So I'm going to start with an article that I read when I was in college at Penn State.
All right.
I had a habit of reading the Daily Collegian, which is the name of the Penn State student newspaper, pretty frequently. I'm a woman of words, a word nerd, if you will. And the article, it was an editorial piece. I remember it to this day. The person who was writing it was talking about wanting to become a professional writer. And that's something that I've always thought about, always secretly had a passion for. But, I grew up with some old stories about, starving artists, writers don't make any money, all that kind of good stuff. And so it wasn't something that I really necessarily believed would be in my future, at least immediately after college.
Can I interrupt you on that for a second?
Sure.
Because you just touched on, I don't know why, maybe it's because I'm a father. That's become such a trigger for me, is because I've realized the same thing. All the things that were pounded in my head about what I should do versus the stuff I find myself doing now, it just makes me mad. Like how we say curiosity kills the cat, but not every cat's dead out there. You know what I mean? Like people bounce back. You have to be curious, or you can do anything you put your mind to, Miles. Well, then I'd just be sitting on the couch surrounded by billions of dollars as I'm thinking about them. Stuff doesn't fall from the sky. You have to take action towards things. And I think that's another one, because similar to you, I took AP English. I took honors composition in college. I had college credit going into college for English stuff because I liked writing. But the sort of academic style of it and just the real world of way people talked about just kind of beat the creativity out of me for a while. And I had to find my way back to it. So it just sucks to hear that you had the same thing. You know what I mean? Like it's because you're so talented. To me, I think about all the things I could have been creating if I hadn't let it be beat out of me,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that's what this article made me realize. And this article was about this person. He was a senior in college, and he was a couple years ahead of me in school. And he wanted to be a writer. And he said the best advice he ever received about becoming a writer was, yes, you can major in English in college, and those skills are transferable and amazing. But don't necessarily start writing when you graduate. Don't look for a writing job. And his solution to that, the advice he received, was that you have to go live your life. You have to have crazy, outrageous experiences to write about. You have to have some kind of life experience, go on road trips, travel, even if it's on a shoestring budget, get a crazy job, like going to a vineyard in Napa and, working with grapes for 2 years, and just something that you would, kind of think outside the box and have these kind of bucket list type of experiences while you're still young and able-bodied to be able to do them. And that's the kind of the nut meat, if you will, the good stuff that you'll pull from when you sit down to start writing 10 years later, 5 years later, 15 years later. When you start interviewing people, you have all of these experiences to pull from that, help you inform the questions you ask people when you're interviewing them, or help you inform the questions you form as you're editing something. So it really impacted me to the point where, it's been 15 plus years since I read that article, I still think about it. I still think about, instead of having and acquiring material possessions based on high income levels, I still think about creating experiences in my life that's more important. So I have something to write about, if that makes sense. Or I have an experience that I can relay that will inform how I edit and how I show up in my professional life.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense. It's that old phrase, you write what you know, right? And to me, that kind of hits on the point I was saying before about you can't just put your mind to something. You can't just think about stuff. You have to go actually experience things. You have to put the work in, take action, and those experiences then will fuel what you sit down to write. Because imagination, while important, can only take you so far. Like you said, you can imagine what it's like to work in a vineyard and the process of making wine, but until you actually do it, you're not going to be able to paint the images with the words about the texture in your hands and the scent in the air and all these things you have to really experience to appreciate and then convey. You have to go out and experience it to write about it. Well, to add on that, to write about it well, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think after reading that article, I really took it to heart. And so one of my first major experiences I took advantage of was I had the opportunity to, I was a secondary education major, and so I was slated to become a high school English teacher. And when it came time to decide where I was going to do my student teaching, I could go back to Pittsburgh, where I grew up, and have the very typical student teaching experience in an American high school in Pittsburgh and get all my credentials. And I could have stayed in Pennsylvania after and got a job. That's what happens. You student teach and they usually hire you on after you're done. But I had the opportunity to travel to Norway, and I taught English in Trondheim, Norway, which is a small coastal town about 6 hours north of Oslo. And it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah, I bet. That's awesome.
And when I went, a lot of people had warned me, you're not having this very traditional student teaching experience. Are you worried about getting a job when you return? And I said, absolutely not. I'm not worried at all. Because I was determined. It was something, I wasn't graduating from college until I studied abroad.
Yeah, good for you.
And that was the way I was able to do it. And the students I encountered in that experience changed my life. It changed my perspective on the world, changed my perspective on education and being grateful for education, not only within the classroom, but the experiences I started having outside the classroom as well. One of the greatest experiences I had teaching there was with this group of about 13 students. There were 2 from Afghanistan, 4 from Africa, a couple from Russia. So they're just a very diverse little class, and their third language was English. So they had their native language, were learning Norwegian, and then English was their third language. And they challenged me on a daily basis on what it meant to be an American, and what that looked like at the time, and what that meant to me, and what that meant to them.
So when you say they challenged you, were they just asking you a bunch of questions, or the way that they carried themselves challenged you to think about it internally?
I think both, just because they were asking really challenging questions that I had never, outside of my little Pennsylvania existence, had never thought of to ask myself.
Sure.
And so they had asked me really tough questions, and they had these incredible stories of survival. They were all seeking political asylum in Norway from their home countries, and they had these, the two brothers from Africa had, literally walked the continent of Africa to get to Norway, and their parents had been killed because of their political beliefs in their countries. On a daily basis, my jaw would drop at the stories they would tell me, and they would tell them openly and happily, and they had almost like this kind of grateful optimism about them, even though they were like tragic stories of loss and death and survival. And it just really opened my eyes up to how other people experience the world in very different ways from myself. And usually most days they taught me a lot more than I could ever teach them. And I will never forget that experience. And unfortunately, this was before social media kind of went wild. And so I was not able to keep in touch with them.
Sure.
So I don't know where they are, what they're up to, but I know there'll be a group of kids that I will never forget.
Yeah, it's interesting. They have to walk the continent of Africa, and we have people that stand in line at Starbucks and complain about the level of foam in their cappuccino.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff that's crazy.
And it was interesting because after I had that experience and graduated from Penn State, I went back and I found a job without much trouble in Northern Virginia. I taught 9th and 11th grade high school English. And I'm not saying this, like, they were wonderful students as well, but there's just a different mentality. There's a different conditioning, a social and cultural conditioning around education in our country, that after having that experience of teaching in a foreign country with people from all over the world who don't have the same educational advantages as we do in America or in the United States, it was very eye-opening to see how we take it for granted.
Sure.
And I got that sense from a lot of my students. And it was just very disheartening as someone who had this really incredible time as a student teacher in a foreign country to come back to home and just kind of just really be hit with the realities of how our culture treats education.
And so that was your first kind of eye-opening experience, like you said. So did you write anything? Going back to that article about you had to experience in order to write, did any content get produced out of that experience?
Well, it wasn't published publicly, but what I did was I kept, and this was, again, I should have kept a blog at that time. It probably would have taken off because blogging was just becoming a thing.
Right,
it was like
right.
The glory days of blogging back then. What I did, though, was I had maintained an email list of just pretty much friends and family who, before I left, had agreed. I had said, do you want to keep in touch with me? Do you want to hear about my journey? And a lot of them absolutely did. And so I sent a series of emails, maybe weekly or so, every couple of days I spent 4 months in Norway. And as a graduation present, and I still have it, as a graduation present, my sister-in-law, she printed every email I sent out and she put it in a like a photo album. She 3-hole punched all the emails. And so I do have it. It's published.
Oh, that's really cool. That's a neat gift.
Yeah, it was an incredible gift. Very thoughtful. And it was just, so I do have documentation of that time, but I never published it formally, I guess I should say.
Right. Publish it formally yet.
Yet.
You could still go back and reflect on it, and that's cool.
Yeah, for sure. Because I was 22, 23 when all of that happened. So it would be interesting to kind of, as my life has unfolded, it would be interesting to go back and read through all of them, see the perspective, how it's changed. Because I'm definitely not a formal teacher anymore like I was, but I feel like as an editor, I still do some teaching.
Yeah, so let's touch on that. You say you're not a formal teacher anymore like you were. So what shook you out of teaching?
It was basically the system. The system is very broken, the public education system in the United States. And I could see very quickly that the system did not serve the entire student population that I was encountering. And, as one person in the trenches day in and day out, it's very discouraging to see that and to realize very quickly that as one single person, there's not a whole lot you can do about it because it's like you versus the system. And there are tiny things you could do to help those that aren't being served, but you just feel so overwhelmed and so hopeless because it's just too much. There's just too many students that aren't getting what they need. So and plus I burned out very quickly. I wanted, I was young and impressionable and I still wanted to, I wanted to do it all. I wanted to be the super teacher. And so I was on all the committees. I coached tennis. I stayed late. I got there early. If they wanted me to do something, I was the first in line to do it. And so by the time my third year approached, I was just exhausted. I was just tired. And I knew I couldn't be, and I had this I saw a lot of the older teachers who were on their way out into retirement had just become so jaded by their careers and they had lost kind of what they had loved about it originally. And it broke my heart. And I just didn't want to be in that position, 25 years from now.
Yeah, it's almost like looking into the future at your future self. And that moment, if you don't leave now, you're going to be that person in a couple of decades.
Yeah. And I also, even back then, I didn't know what it would have looked like, but I definitely had some entrepreneurial leanings in a professional way, in a personal way. I knew that I didn't necessarily wanted to do it the very traditional corporate route in terms of being, interested in business. I knew I never wanted to go to business school in a very formal way, but I knew someday that being an entrepreneur or freelancer, kind of doing something on my own was going to be a part of my professional life. But, way back then, I didn't know what that was going to look like. So
Right. So you realized you didn't want to be that grumpy teacher in a couple decades. So you quit and did what? What was next?
I went to grad school.
Still couldn't escape the education.
Right. So I went to journalism school because I thought, well, being a teacher of writing is a very different thing compared to actually doing the writing myself. And what better way than to actually do the writing? But I think I was still kind of locked into that. I needed the structure. I needed the system, or my ego needed the name on the diploma of the program and the school to prove to myself that I was a writer.
Yeah, I think more than your ego, society kind of needs that too in many fields. So if you really wanted to pursue it, then you almost need to have that entry ticket and the piece of paper with your name on it from the journalism school to land the job.
Right. And so I felt like I couldn't be a writer without it. To me, I felt like now I can look back on it and say it was just another one of those experiences. Because I went through it and realized that being a traditional journalist wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. I wasn't going to go, be a social media journalist, because social media was just blowing up at the time when I was entering grad school for journalism. And I didn't want to be a traditional journalist because those were kind of becoming few and far between because of the downturn in newspaper journalism specifically, and broadcast journalism wasn't up my alley either. And so I went through the program. I completed it. I loved it. I mean, there were parts that I really loved. I still love being a student. And I think that's what kept me going. I'm still curious, and I love studying grammar. I love studying editing. I love studying magazines and design, and just like the whole creative aspect that goes into producing a beautiful piece of media. And because it can be very powerful and life-changing if it's done well, and if it's done in the right circumstances and the right heart behind it. And I just like the kind of intellectual debate that we would have in classes and outside of classes, and we would have happy hours and talk about nerdy journalism topics and all that kind of fun stuff.
Word Nerds Anonymous, right?
Right, exactly. We met every Tuesday. My name's Kathleen and I'm a word nerd. And
you probably have to say an actual haiku or something, not that short.
Yeah, I think we did something silly like that for sure.
I'm with you though on the education and the structure. And I think, we said in the intro to this thing about unseen work, and that's sort of what brought us together and our working relationship to the next level. But there's something to be said for knowing that there's an end at some point in the future, and that satisfaction of chipping away at it. You're X credits away, now you're Y credits away, you're at your capstone. It's like you know what you're working towards is going to get you a definitive result versus just putting in the endless amount of work that can be the rest of your life without quite knowing how the dots are going to connect.
Yeah, for sure. And I did enjoy that part of it. And because I knew that I didn't want to be a traditional journalist, when it came time to figure out what I wanted to do for my thesis, and then it was more of a project, and I also have to have an internship that it was kind of correlated with my project. And so I was an external relation intern at a national security think tank in Washington, D.C. So I had lived in Northern Virginia outside of D.C., been a teacher, moved to Missouri to go to grad school, and then for the last semester went back to D.C. to complete my internship at the National Security Think Tank and then write my project or my thesis. So that was kind of the next mind-bending
Yeah, what did they do at a national security think tank?
So they would write policy that they would recommend to actual lawmakers who could put it into action. And the minds that were in the office in that room just blew me away. So we had policy experts on India, China, Brazil. We had experts on cybersecurity, internet freedom, military security, any kind of national security topic you can dream up of. That was in the office. And we had these staff meetings every Tuesday morning at 9:00. And the National Security Think Tank I was a part of, they were very proud they called themselves a flat organization. So when we were in those meetings, any of the policy interns or the external relations interns, which is what I was, from us all the way up to the CEO and the president could make any kind of comment, be a part of the discussion, because there would be a portion, like after we would get through the agenda of kind of administrative business, there would be a portion where we would talk about like the latest topic of the day, like what was going on in the national security world. And at the time, the Arab Spring had been taking place. So we had a lot of interesting discussions about national security and the role social media was playing in speeding up protests and gatherings and all of that interesting stuff. And so we would have these amazing staff meetings on Tuesday mornings. And sometimes I would just sit there like the sponge, just absorbing all of these brilliant people that I knew in my heart I will never be in the same room as these people again. So I just wanted to really take advantage of it. And some days, like we would go back to our little intern cubicles, and like I would, peek my head over to the policy interns who were specializing in a specific area and be like, guys, what just happened in there? Could you explain it in like English? Because I don't have a national security background, and it wasn't something, I was just there to, to make sure people, I was in charge of events and marketing and making sure that, people's names were spelled right in the PR, the press releases and all of that fun stuff.
Right.
So the actual, policy stuff was just a little above my head most days. And it was just such a fascinating experience. Like some of the high-ranking military officials that I had the privy to meet and escort to the bathroom at meetings and serve lunch to and get coffee for. And just months after the internship had been over, I would be in my house watching like a Pentagon press conference, and I would just sit there and be like, oh, I met that guy. I had lunch with that guy.
Yeah, that's cool.
High-ranking military official. And I'd be like,
Well, and again, what's interesting is, writing what you know, meeting all sorts of different people like that know all sorts of different things. It's really just great background research for character development in the future.
Yeah, like when you put it that way, it makes it seem less random. Because that experience always felt very random. Because I was just like, when I bring it up, people are like, well, do you have a background in national security? I'm like, no, not even a little bit. And so it was just like when you put it that way, like as a character development study, like that makes it feel a little bit less.
There
random.
You go. That's my PR spin on it for you.
Thank you.
So since it's so random, then you left it and you didn't go into foreign relations or whatever. Mm-hmm. So what's the next step on your wild twist of a journey here?
Yeah, well, after that, again, because I knew that I wasn't taking the traditional journalism route, but I still wanted to be media, both fascinates and terrifies me. And so I knew that I didn't want to necessarily leave it all behind, because I spent a good 2 years obviously studying it and earning a master's degree in it. So kind of being at the right place at the right time a little bit, there was a consulting firm here in Florida where my family happened to live. They were just spearheading a new project on new media and what that looked like, and specifically local media. And so they started this program to better educate local news journalists who were creating online news sites for their local communities, and not really they were writing great content. They were covering great news for their little small communities because the daily metros weren't able to cover the small communities where they lived. But they didn't realize that they were kind of, in a way, creating their own small media conglomerations. They were their own these websites were like their own little media empires. And so in order to be able to keep the lights on, to pay the bills, they had to find some way to make it sustainable, to make it so that they could cover, and serve their communities with this much needed local journalism. But they also had to kind of incorporate the dirty word of advertising.
Yeah, someone's got to pay the bills. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of these newspaper or local news journalists who had started these websites they had a very adverse reaction to doing that, because when they were working for, say, the Wall Street Journal as a very traditional old school journalist, back in the day, journalism was kept separate from the business side. Right. And never should the two meet. Because that was a conflict of interest, and the journalists kind of saw the business side as kind of the evil, money grubbing,
Sure.
advertising people. So there was a lot of resistance in the room when we I helped put together a conference where they gathered all of these local journalists that were from across the country, and there was a lot of resistance in the room when one of the solutions that was brought up was, well, you should sell ads for on your website. And so it was a lot of kind of unlearning, dismantling those kind of thoughts about, business versus journalism. And so I took part in developing some curriculum, like business curriculum, some entrepreneurial curriculum around making that a more comfortable transition for those journalists. So I did that kind of work for about a year and a half here in Sarasota. And then it was driving me batty to be in the aging population that is this town. And so I started applying again to grad school because I didn't see any other way to get out, because there wasn't really any upward trajectory in what I was doing. It was just kind of this temporary project that I had been working on. Like, I didn't even know what to call myself. Was I a media researcher? Was I a conference planner?
Yeah, I didn't. When you were describing that, I was trying to put a label to it too, and it's a very, very unique situation there, especially at the time. Right. I'm sure when it was the convergence of new media, like you said, nobody knew what to call it.
Right. And so I didn't know how to sell it. I didn't know how to get more work like that, because no one else was doing anything like that. And so I kind of, after the project was over, I wasn't really quite sure where to go or what to do. And when I was in DC, when I was interning, I had joined an entrepreneurial book club while I was there. And what we did, we met every other week and read entrepreneurial books. And so through that group, I had met a woman who was a PR. She owned her own PR company, and she was spearheading a new project with a tech company out in California where she called it nurture marketing. So she was taking a different spin on kind of cold calling, sales calling, trying to sell software to different companies. And so she assembled a group of us. We came from all different kinds of backgrounds, and none of us really had any sales experience. But for a whole year, we worked on behalf of this tech company in California as salespeople. And so for a whole year, I had a list of 100 people that I called. I called, I guess, 20 every day during the work week. And it was about calling those same 100 people for as long as I could until I got a sale.
Wow.
And so I did that for almost a year and sold nothing.
Yeah, I'm surprised you made it a year. I feel like I could do that for a month and then I'd be checked out. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so it was kind of an insane and interesting year. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about rejection and kind of just being okay with it.
Well, that's a great lesson to learn. I mean, most people don't know what to do when they hear the word no and they completely shut down. So being okay with that is a great thing.
Yeah. And we would check in with each other. We would have weekly meetings and we would talk about what that felt like and how we could change our pitch and all of that. And so it was a very interesting year. Cause I was selling disaster recovery software and, so we were trying to figure out every which way to make that spin. But at the end of that year, they decided to end the relationship. And so in the meantime, while that all was happening, I was just feeling kind of I don't know what to do with my life. And I thought, well, going back to grad school again, maybe for a PhD sounds like a good idea.
When in doubt, go to school. All right.
Go back to school. So I applied to a couple different PhD programs, and I got into the University of Texas at Austin. And this time it was a PhD in education. So the goal my original plan was to go to UT, and I wanted to marry the two things that I was so passionate about. So I wanted to study high school English with the lens of kind of incorporating critical media literacy. So having young people really understand the media that they're consuming, how influential it is, how persuasive it is, and just really looking at it in a different way so they're not swayed by it one way or the other, that they can kind of look at a couple different sources, understand that it's important to look at verified sources, kind of looking at the different whether or not, how to evaluate a source. Is it good? Is it bad? Can you trust it? Is it credible? Is it verified? Are there multiple resources within it?
Right.
So kind of marry those things that I learned in journalism school and I was so passionate about talking about at Word Nerd Club.
Right. Yeah, so do your own research, make your own opinion before you see one article about the coronavirus and go buy all the toilet paper at Trader Joe's.
Right. Exactly. And so
I'm with you.
I wanted to marry like that stuff, the media stuff, with what I knew as a teacher, as an educator, in changing pedagogy and all of that fun stuff. And so I went to UT and had a great first year. First 2 semesters were great. Met a lot of great people. Loved Austin. Loved my roommates. All of my everything was seemingly going really well. And then the second year, my second year started, and it felt like there are different points in a PhD program where they kind of weed you out, and I felt like I was being pushed out. I felt like I was being weeded out very quickly, and I understood why. No one was really interested in what I was interested in. Just the professors weren't really studying that, and what they were studying I cared about, but that wasn't why I had signed up for it in the beginning anyway.
Sure.
And so I kind of made a very tough decision, because this PhD program was the first thing, I made the decision to end it. This was the first thing in my life that I had actually quit. I took it pretty hard, and kind of being my own harshest critic, didn't feel good about it. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just finish it to finish it, because that's not something you can do and survive in terms of a PhD program. Like, those are intense, really strenuous, very stressful programs, and it wouldn't have been healthy to continue. And so I had to kind of reconcile that internally. And I went to the graduate advisor and said, all right, obviously this isn't working out for you all. This isn't working out for me. And I think it's best if we part ways. But I've worked really hard for 2 years. I don't really want to leave without anything. So what do I have to do to get another master's degree instead? And they said, well, you take this class and we'll give you another master's degree. So I said, all right, took the class, and I have a master's degree in education with a focus in language and literacy studies.
There you go.
So did that, and again, felt like in a very, very similar place as where I was after the first stint in grad school, in journalism school, and just didn't really know where I was supposed to go or what I was supposed to do. And so I stayed in Austin for another 2 years, and I found a job actually within the journalism school at the University of Texas. I was a program coordinator for it was a center within the SAT in the journalism school, the School of Journalism, and it was called the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas. So the Knight Center, the Knight Foundation, is was previously a huge supporter of journalism across the country and around the world, and so this was one of the many centers they had that were attached to colleges across the United States. And so I was the program coordinator, and what we did a couple of different things. We had a blog that covered freedom of expression issues in South America, in Portugal and Spain. And so we had content in all 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. Then we produced online courses, professional development courses in all 3 languages for journalists. So there would be a online course in how to better use video in journalism in Portuguese. So we had all of that, and my main responsibility, aside from making sure that the whole center was functioning budget-wise, human capital-wise, and all of that, was to plan and coordinate a multi-day, multi-venue conference that looked at the future of online journalism. So once a year, kind of the greatest minds in journalism, the director, he would gather all of these amazing journalism and media people and bring them to Austin. And it was my responsibility to make sure they had hotels, their flights were paid for, they had all the events aligned, like, all the mini events, like the happy hours, the lunches, and all of that was coordinated. So I did that for almost 2 years. And while that was super fun, and it was a very administrative job. And again, it was one of those kind of eye-opening moments where I realized that higher ed bureaucracy wasn't my jam.
Is it anyone's?
Some people really dig it.
Yeah.
And they get into the system, and they can't see outside of the system. And so they're just comfortable, and they kind of accept it for what it is. And they just kind of motor along, That's interesting. So it's another instance of when you were a teacher
the first time, right? And you realized
Yeah.
what you didn't want to be. It sort of sounds like it was sort of the same thing when it came to higher ed.
Yeah. Yeah. So you would think I would recognize these patterns, right? It would kind of
Well, don't tell me
dawn on
after
me.
that you went to grad school again, because then
No.
I'll
I'm
lose
done
it.
with done with grad school forever. I never want to step back into that kind of classroom ever again. And so I was just like, I still have some entrepreneurial inklings to explore, and I was having some, because I was stressed out about my job, and just the kind of, I wasn't feeling good about the physical environment I was in, job wise and personally. My physical health started to suffer, and so I kind of went on this journey to kind of inspect what was happening with all of that, and I started a year-long course and looked into becoming a certified holistic health coach. And so it wasn't grad school, but it was definitely a structure and a program.
Sure.
And so while I was still doing my program coordinator job, I would work on the course. It was a self-paced course that I would get into mainly once a week. I would do the modules, and it was a year-long course. And after a year, I got my little coaching certificate, and my intention was to start a holistic health coaching business. And so decided it wasn't a good idea to stay in Austin anymore. And so without really a plan, any savings or anything, I decided it was a good idea to go to Southern California and start that. So I packed up my little car with all of my earthly possessions and moved to San Diego.
Wow. So from PA to Norway to Virginia to Missouri to DC to Texas to California.
Yeah.
All right. I'm with you.
Yeah. Are the dots connecting yet?
We're getting there. There.
So like I said, I mapped out my semi cross country journey because I was in Texas, so it wasn't full cross country. But Texas is a big state. Now the majority of my drive wasn't, but I made it. I stopped in Bisbee, Arizona. I stopped in Sedona, and then finally made it to San Diego. And I had a plan I had set up an exchange. There was a woman who needed a dog sitter for a couple of months. In exchange to live, like I stayed in her house while she was out and about.
That's cool. That's a good gig.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I did that until I was supposed to get kind of my feet on the ground, and it's hard to transition, to move to a new place, and also not have a job.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that. Like, what's that headspace like? You're sitting in San Diego.
Yeah.
You have a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degree, and a holistic coaching certificate, and you're a dog sitter. Like, did that like just not like I don't know, did that suck for you? Was you like, okay, this is all part of the journey, I'm gonna make it, or are you sitting there like, what have I done?
Well, I think the novelty of being in Southern California wore out very quickly, and I had a definite kind of oh shit moment, and I kind of went into survival mode to an extreme that I had never felt before. I always felt like a lot of the things I had done, like the grad school, and just moving around a lot, always kind of felt very, like, kind of in survival mode. Like, once I got settled, things were okay, and I was doing, like, I accomplished stuff, I got things done, I was able to function as a kind of semi-normal adult, and have a social life and all of that. But this adventure in California was a different kind of a ball game for me. Literally, like, after the pet sitting gig happened, I lived in like 6 or 7 different places. Almost had to sleep in my car. I worked for Apple for like 4 months. I was a meeting planner for them, and because I had a lot of stuff personally happening, I wasn't presenting myself very well in my professional life, and that made things worse.
Sure.
So not only, like, I was in survival mode, but I couldn't represent myself professionally the way I wanted to.
Which makes it hard to survive.
Right. So I wasn't showing up authentically very well anywhere in my life, in my friendships that I was trying to make. I didn't feel like me. And even like I had a friend from Austin who periodically would call me while I was in California to check up on me to make sure I was okay. And after I left California, she had confessed to me that she said, I was worried about you because every time I spoke with you, I could just feel like your spirit was drifting. Like you weren't grounded in anything. You weren't rooted in anything. And you felt just not well. And so I was like, yeah, that's probably accurate.
So then what was the sort of rock bottom moment where you said, okay, I have to leave California now?
So I had just passed my 1 year anniversary in San Diego. I had spent the summer up. Actually, I had a pretty good summer. I was a Lyft driver that summer. I had a really fun. I was living in a really fun part of town. I met some really nice roommates, and so it wasn't all bad. I don't want to, make it out like it was like all bad. It wasn't. But shortly after I had moved out of this fun place, I stopped Lyft driving because in my Lyft driving, I had met someone who needed a copywriter. And I was like, oh, maybe I should get back into writing and editing, all of that stuff. And so again, being a Lyft driver for me was writing fodder. Like whenever I would meet people, that was the main reason I started to do it, because I wanted to have new fun stories. And this was my only way, because I couldn't afford to go out and be social in San Diego. Like living vicariously through my Lyft passengers and getting to know their stories as I was driving them around San Diego was my way of doing that.
Sure.
And
I bet they're pretty candid with their stories, because they're like, oh, I'm never going to see this person again. Let's just get into it.
Like that could be another podcast episode completely.
I thought that every time I ride in an Uber or Lyft, like they should just have microphones going the whole time and produce a podcast from the car, because there's so many stories.
Oh my gosh, it's insane, because it's better than even going to your hairdresser, because your hairdresser you see like probably on like a monthly or like however frequently you get your haircut. But a Lyft driver, like you said, you're never going to see them again.
And if you do, they come up in your app. You're like, oh no, cancel this ride. I can't talk to that guy.
Because people would get in my car and just unload all of their stuff, and I was just like, "Whoa, this is insane!" And of course, after my shifts would be over, I would write them all down. So I have like a log of all of the stories I've been told.
Oh, that's cool. So just still sitting on those though? You haven't done anything with them writing wise?
Right? Yeah, I have lots of fodder. I have like journals and journals.
I gotta say, this whole story feels like a Netflix original series to me. Like you could be writing a screenplay about
I know
all of the stuff, because all the characters you can infuse and the lessons learned and the ups and the downs. And this is so true for so many people though. And that's why I think it'd be relatable and people would watch it.
Yeah, I hope maybe. But, well, anyway, so back to California. So after that summer, I started working as a copywriter for an ad agency, and they were very old school in their professional work. And again, I really need to not be sucked back into kind of bureaucratic. Obviously it's a pattern that I need to change. And I think I've started to do that, because I work for a company now that is not bureaucratic, and I'm doing my own thing. And so I've hopefully finally learned my lesson there. But anyway, so I had started with this ad agency and moved into a new place. And the person that had owned the condo where I was living also lived in the condo, and she had chosen another person to live in the room next to mine. And unbeknownst to the two of us, the person who had moved into the other room had some criminal background stuff that he had not been forthcoming with, either one of us.
Wow.
And so one day we got a knock on the door, and police parole officers were at the door, and it was just a very unsettling experience, because we had been lied to, and he just wasn't forthcoming with his situation, the circumstances under which he had been paroled. And it just kind of triggered a lot of things I just hadn't dealt with emotionally from past experiences that I had in college. And it just kind of made me realize that my moves that I had made, I think, were an effort in like in my mind, I always thought all of these things would fix the things that I hadn't dealt with, that I would all of a sudden show up differently because I was in a new place. But what I learned quickly and kind of figured out in this past year when I moved back to Florida, excuse me, was that that's just geography. Like I can move 10 more times, but had I not made the decision to kind of have this kind of being drawn to my knees in surrender in California, where I got so triggered by this living experience, that I knew I needed to come back to where my family was in Sarasota. And I needed to deal with all of that stuff because the common denominator in all of this is me, right? Yeah. And so it didn't matter what city I was in. It didn't matter what grad school program I was in. It didn't matter what bureaucratic craziness I was a part of. I was still showing up the same way. I was still dealing with the same stuff, different day, different city. And I knew if I wanted to live the life I've always envisioned for myself, and that is, owning my own business, being a freelancer, an entrepreneur, creating those fun experiences for which I have to write about, essentially the bucket list items that I have that I want to experience. I knew I needed to heal. I needed to really kind of dig down deep and look at that stuff, even though it was super hard and uncomfortable and not so fun. I was willing to endure short-term pain for long-term happiness and payoff. I was confident that there was an other side to, like, there's a better way to live than how I had been living. And I wanted to show up differently. And I was tired of the way I had been showing up through all those experiences. Even though there were a lot of bright spots, a lot of lessons learned, a lot of great people I had met, I wasn't always happy with who I showed up to be in those times, in those experiences. And I knew I wanted to show up differently. I wanted to show up more authentically, with more integrity, with more confidence. And I really needed to tackle it. It was like now or never.
Yeah. And so that brings us to the present moment of sorts, right? So how have you been able to do all that?
So a lot of it, I found a good, and I'm not ashamed to talk about this, I found a very good therapist who helped me process the things that I had not dealt with effectively. And I encourage anyone dealing with any kind of emotional stuff to really find a coach, a counselor, a therapist, whatever you want to call it, a support group, just because you can't do this life alone. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned in this year in coming back to California, or to Florida, and really dealing with my stuff, was that the ability to ask for help has been a game changer for me.
Yeah.
And
that's a huge lesson for a lot of people to learn. Not everybody does. So that's good, good for you to realize that. And to, like you said, you're not ashamed to admit it. I think more people should have a therapist, right? Like, yeah. The world would be a better place if everybody worked through their stuff and didn't project it on other people. So that's awesome.
Yeah. And that's what I found that I had been doing. Like, I was with friendships, with coworkers, how I was treating them was I was working out my shit on them. And that's not fun for anybody. That's not appropriate. That made me feel like a bad human being. And again, that's not how I want to show up. And so, like I said, found a good therapist, found a job where I didn't have to think about anything too much. It's not cerebral. And so I could go into that job and really kind of be inside my head and deal with the emotional stuff without worrying about, not being there, being fully present in terms of like, oh, you have to do this meeting or that meeting or plan this event. So I'm grateful for that job. And while I've been able to do that, deal with that stuff, I started, I joined the Strive It Mastermind group to kind of spearhead all of my entrepreneurial leanings, my editing business, my writing. So it's just now kind of starting to come together. And I have never felt as good as I do in this present moment, in terms of things that have been put behind me, like having tools. Because, shitty stuff's going to continue to happen. Like, that's just life, right?
Yeah.
And so I now have tools, the ability to ask for help when all of that stuff kind of, when stuff does come up. And so I feel like because of what I've experienced, both professionally, personally, I'm in a really good spot. I feel confident about the things that are happening, the opportunities that are coming up, the things I'm attracting instead of constantly chasing, which I think was also a game changer for me. When you're constantly chasing something, you're not enjoying the present moment. Sometimes you're chasing things that aren't meant for you. And, you can't, you could try and fit the square peg into the round hole all you want, but it's never going to happen.
Right.
And that's exhausting. And I think for a lot of the stuff that I've done, always kind of felt like I was trying too hard, right? And trying to make it work, trying to be something that maybe I wasn't at the time. And I mean, not to say that like life has been an experiment and it always should be, but a lot of that stuff, like looking back, while it does add to my ability to be a better editor and a better writer, doesn't always, to me, seem cohesive. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think if everybody's honest with themselves, life's not cohesive. We're never on just one linear path to something. So it's
right.
It's
and I think my next level of, I don't know if you want to call it healing or transformation, I guess would be a better word at this point, is really kind of having a radical acceptance of what I've been through, the things I've accomplished, and I'm beginning to start like accepting those things and just really being very comfortable with my past in my present, and being present with people in my life at the moment and enjoying them for, where we all are on our journey, whether it's ahead, right in front of me, or behind. And, now it's just about kind of attracting the things that are meant for me and radically accepting them.
I love that. And so we've laid out all the dots in the past, and I'd like you to just talk a little bit about some of the cool stuff you got going on right now. I mean, all these life experiences have led up to make you a better writer and editor, and I know you have some exciting editing and writing gigs on the horizon. So what has all of this led you to?
Sure. So, helping you with your work, with your book, which I love. It's super fun.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's your favorite, right? That one.
Yeah, of course. Number one. I love it. I love reading. Like I firmly believe everyone has a story. And so it brings me joy to be able to read a book like yours. And, and I hope I attract more of those kinds of that work, because, everyone has a story, and people need to hear other people's stories. Like, you just have to, you have to get outside of your echo chamber, and people, because there was a moment in my own life where my voice was lost for a number of reasons. Editing to me feels like my way of helping other people find their voice and make it better. And that's what I feel like my mission has become because of all the things I've experienced. And it feels very purposeful, and it feels like it doesn't feel like work to me. When I edit your book, it doesn't feel like I'm doing work. And
well, that's how going back to your thing about you shouldn't have to chase everything all the time. That's that feeling I think most people are chasing, is feeling like work isn't work. It's that ultimate passion in which you love to do every day. When you could find that, you just grab on with both hands and go for the ride.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have your book going on. I have a contract out to edit some curriculum for a nonprofit based in DC, which I'm really excited about. I'm in doing this podcast interview, you're also helping me start my own podcast. I'm very interested and excited about talking with folks about accountability in the near future, and creating some really fun content around that.
Yeah, I want to hear all your lift stories in a podcast too. Break out these notebooks and just gather around the campfire. That'd be fun.
Well, I also forgot to include that I was also a Lyft driver in Austin as well. And so I have stories from there as well.
Nice.
So I have all this fodder, and it's just about like figuring out a medium and a platform to really put it out there. And it's starting small. Like right now I do have my blog that I post weekly about kind of doing entrepreneurialism in my own way, kind of tackling a lot of those things and being pretty transparent about how I'm going about doing that, in hopes that when people read it, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've had the same same kind of issue. And, I never really thought about it that way. So that's
Right.
kind of cool that she's tackling it this way. So yeah, so there's a lot of fun projects on the horizon, things that are kind of still out there and in potential stages. Haven't, received payments or contracts just yet, but I'm hoping that those things will all kind of come together and just kind of, kind of do the things that I love so I can live the life that I love.
I think that's all anybody wants.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So as you look back and hear yourself go through your whole story, right, and you're reflecting on it as you're sharing it with all of us, how would you describe your life so far or your life right now? You can pick, but how would you describe that in 3 words?
Can I do 3 words for each, like before and now?
Sure, you can. Yeah.
Okay. So before, I think adventurous, chaotic, experimental. Is that a word?
Yeah, it is. Experimental is a word. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Those are the 3 for that. And then for now, I think rooted, calm, and excited.
It's funny how those are very opposite.
Right?
Adventurous to rooted, chaotic to calm, and experimental to exciting. I guess the last one's kind of the same.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting, and it's...
Well, and I think, I've never, we all make different choices, right? Like some people got jobs right after, very solid jobs right after college, got married, started having kids. And that's one very great choice in life. And that's awesome. But I knew from a very young age that I didn't want that to happen to me. That wasn't what I wanted when I left college. I think maybe part of me wanted it because I was so sucked into kind of the cultural expectation of that. But even though a lot of the things I've been through were hard or didn't always make sense in those moments, I wouldn't change any of it because then, I had this crazy chaotic 15 plus years after college. And now I feel like it's time to be grounded. It's time to be rooted. It's time to settle down a little bit. And I don't think I would have been able to feel that. I think knowing who I am and who I've always been, I think had I gotten married and kind of fallen into the kind of the cultural expectation of what I thought I was supposed to do, I think I would have been miserable and restless. But now that I've had all of these crazy experiences, I'm just okay. I feel like I breathe better now than I did before. And I feel like I've done my crazy stuff,
Sure. That makes total sense.
You know what I mean? And so I don't feel this need, in this moment, I don't feel like I have, I'm going to have a crazy midlife crisis. You know what I mean? I had a extended quarter life crisis.
You got out of the way early.
Exactly.
I love that.
And so, I think for me, that was the path that I needed to go on to get here, right? To feel rooted, some people, they felt rooted in that career the first one they had when they left college, they felt rooted in that marriage or having a child. And that's wonderful, but I never found those things or attracted those things or chased those things because I don't think I wanted them. And so now that I've experienced all this stuff, I feel, whatever I attract next, I think it comes from a different place. It is rooted. I feel centered. I feel, with my feet are on the ground, in contrast to when my friend had called me in California and had said, your spirit is scattered, Kathleen. I don't know where you are right now. And, it's a very different feeling for me to feel so rooted and centered in this moment, but I do. So.
That's great. So use that phrase, we don't know where you are right now, to talk about where can we find you right now. People listen to this episode and they want to know where you are right now. Where can they go online to find that blog or your socials to follow your journey and ask you to edit their stuff, hire you, all those great things?
Sure. So the 2 main places I have a website, KathleenMajorski.com, and I mainly post on Instagram, which my handle is at pinkninja218.
Another podcast episode there, I'm sure, too.
Yeah, yes. I have so many stories, Miles. And then I also post my blog posts on LinkedIn. So you can find me, you can just search my name, Kathleen Majorski, and you can. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all those stories with us. And I'm sure a lot of people out there are going to connect with what you had to say. So I'm looking forward to getting it out there and sharing it with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. This was really fun. I really appreciate you, Miles. Thank you.
All right. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Relish the Journey. Thank you all so much for listening, and a special thank you to Kathleen for being our guest this week. If you want to send me feedback on the show or you need help getting in touch with Kathleen, shoot me an email. You can reach me at Miles, that's MYLES, @rtjmedia.com. Until next time, everyone, cheers.